My name is Jake. I used to be a wildlife photographer, the kind that chases storms and treks through jungles to capture those rare, fleeting moments that no one else dares to. It's the thrill that got me into it, I think. The chase, the danger, the stories. But after a few years, I burned out. Not on the photography, never that, but on everything else. The deadlines, the constant travel, the way every photo felt like just another paycheck instead of a passion. I was flipping through some online forums one night, half drunk on nostalgia and whiskey, when I stumbled on a thread about a zoo not far from where I'd grown up. People were talking about strange creatures, ones that didn't look like anything in the guidebooks. Unnatural, they called them. Undocumented. Some claimed the zoo had been around forever, older than the city itself. Others swore it wasn't there a decade ago. The stories hooked me, tugging at that old, reckless curiosity. I applied for the night watch job on a whim, thinking it'd be a side gig while I checked out the rumors. I didn't expect to get a call back, but the manager, Mr. Hale, hired me after a 10-minute phone interview. The only condition was that I read and agree to a set of rules. The rules were weird. Not your standard, don't let anyone in after hours kind of thing. These were specific. Unsettling. But hey, it's a job, right? Besides, I figured they were just trying to keep the place mysterious for tourists or something. My first shift started last Friday. The zoo was even stranger than I expected. It felt too big for the plot of land it sat on, like it folded in on itself somehow. The air smelled wrong, too, like damp leaves and copper, no matter where I went. The first hour was uneventful. I walked the marked patrol paths, flashlight in hand, listening to the distant sounds of animals stirring in their enclosures. That's when I heard it. A shuffle just behind me, followed by the faintest sound of breathing. At first, I thought it was one of the animals, maybe something loose. I turned my head just a little, trying to catch a glimpse without making it obvious. Nothing. Just darkness and the edge of the patrol path. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, like a whisper in the back of my mind, I remembered. Third rule, do not run if you hear soft breathing behind you. Walk calmly to the nearest light source. So that's what I did. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced my feet to move slowly, deliberately. Step by step, I made my way toward the nearest lamppost, its cold white light flickering just ahead. The breathing followed me the whole way, growing softer the closer I got to the light. When I finally stepped into the glow, the sound stopped. I waited there for what felt like hours, staring into the shadows, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I finished the patrol and returned to the security office. I didn't sleep much that day. The next night, I showed up at 8 p.m., ready to start my shift. Mr. Hale was waiting for me by the entrance. He handed me a clipboard with the patrol schedule and a small map of the zoo. His expression was calm but distant, like he was seeing through me instead of looking at me. "Remember the rules," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "They're not suggestions." I nodded, feeling a prickle of unease. The first half of the night was quiet again, almost boring. I checked the enclosures, made notes on the clipboard, and tried not to let the eerie silence get to me. The animals hardly made a sound, except for the occasional rustle or low growl. Around 2 a.m., I was walking past the reptile house when I spotted someone up ahead, standing just off the path. They were swaying slightly, their head tilted at an odd angle. I called out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here." They didn't respond. I walked closer, keeping my flashlight aimed at the ground so I wouldn't blind them. As I got within a few feet, they turned toward me, their face obscured by the shadow of their hood. "Hey," I said again, "are you okay? What's your name?" The figure hesitated, their mouth opening and closing like they were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. A cold knot of fear coiled in my stomach. First rule: if you encounter another employee who appears dazed or unfamiliar, ask them their name. If they hesitate, run. Without waiting for an answer, I turned and bolted back down the path, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the security office, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night watching the monitors, but the figure never showed up again. When my shift ended, I asked Mr. Hale about it. He just smiled, a tight, humorless thing, and said, "You're still here. That's all that matters." The third night felt different before it even began. The air was heavier somehow, and the usual background noise of the zoo seemed muted, like the animals were holding their breath. I didn't see Mr. Hale when I arrived, but the clipboard with my patrol schedule was waiting on the desk in the security office. I started my rounds at 9 p.m., sticking to the marked paths like the rules instructed. The flashlight beam felt too weak, barely slicing through the dense shadows around me. As I passed the large carnivore enclosure, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something moving inside. The sign outside said, "Closed for renovations," but that didn't explain the heavy thuds and low growls coming from within. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to investigate, but the clipboard didn't mention anything about checking closed exhibits. So I kept walking. Halfway through the night, the power went out. It wasn't gradual, like a flicker or a surge. It was instant, plunging everything into pitch-black silence. My flashlight was my only lifeline, its narrow beam barely illuminating the path ahead. My heart started racing as I remembered the sixth rule. If the power goes out, make your way to the central security office without stopping. Ignore any movement in the shadows. The urge to freeze or look around was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to keep walking. The zoo felt alive in the darkness, with faint rustles and whispers brushing against my ears. Something shifted in the shadows to my right, just out of the flashlight's reach. "Don't stop. Don't look." I picked up my pace, my breaths coming faster as the security office came into view. It wasn't far, but the darkness stretched the distance, making every step feel like a mile. The whispers grew louder, almost like voices now, calling my name in soft, distorted tones. I clenched the flashlight tighter, focusing on the faint outline of the office door. Just a few more steps. I reached the door and slammed it shut behind me, locking it with shaking hands. The power came back on a minute later, and the monitors flickered to life. I scanned the feeds, but the shadows were empty. Whatever had been out there was gone. For the rest of the shift, I stayed in the office, too rattled to continue the patrol. When morning came, Mr. Hale still wasn't there. By the fourth night, I'd memorized the rules and felt like I was walking into a trap. Mr. Hale's absence was unsettling, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the zoo itself was watching me, testing me. The patrol started quietly enough, but as I passed the aviary, I noticed one of the enclosures was open. The sign said it housed a pair of golden eagles, but there was no movement inside, just a hollow silence that made my skin crawl. I radioed it in, but no one responded. The static on the other end sounded wrong, almost like faint breathing mixed with the crackle. Ignoring the growing tension in my chest, I continued my rounds. I was nearing the nocturnal exhibits when I spotted something out of the corner of my eye, movement in the restricted area. It was subtle, just a flash of motion between the trees, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. The restricted areas were off limits unless management gave explicit instructions, and I hadn't received any. Fifth rule, stick to the marked patrol paths. Do not stray into restricted areas unless explicitly instructed by management. Still, the curiosity that had gotten me into this job in the first place flared up. What could be out there? Another employee? An animal? Or something else entirely? I told myself to walk away, but my feet refused to move. Against every instinct, I turned toward the restricted area, stepping off the patrol path. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating, and the trees seemed unnaturally close together, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. My flashlight flickered as I walked, the beam cutting through the darkness like a fragile thread. That's when I saw it. A shape, no, a silhouette, standing perfectly still about 20 feet ahead. It was tall and human-like, but its proportions were off. Its arms were too long, its neck too thin, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It just stood there watching, or maybe waiting. My mind raced, replaying the rules over and over, but none of them mentioned what to do in this situation. The flashlight flickered again, and when the beam steadied, the figure was gone. I stumbled backward, my breath catching in my throat. That's when I heard it, soft breathing, right behind me. I froze, the third rule echoing in my mind. Do not run if you hear soft breathing behind you. Walk calmly to the nearest light source. My hands trembled as I lowered the flashlight and started walking, each step deliberate and slow. The breathing followed, growing louder with every step I took. When I finally reached the edge of the restricted area and stepped back onto the patrol path, the sound stopped. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just darkness and the faint rustle of leaves. I didn't finish the patrol that night. Instead, I went straight back to the security office, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the shift, I stared at the monitors, half expecting to see the figure again. But it never appeared. The fifth night, I wasn't sure I was ready to face whatever it was that had been lurking in the zoo. Every creak of the building and rustle in the trees felt like a warning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always just out of sight, watching me. By now, the routine had become a bit of a trap. I knew I couldn't leave, and I couldn't ignore the pull to understand what was really going on here. The atmosphere of the zoo was different now, as if the shadows themselves were alive and waiting. I was at the feeding area when I noticed the bins were empty. The rule was simple: never feed the animals anything except what is provided in the designated bins. And yet, here I was, staring at a completely empty bin, knowing full well I couldn't fill it with anything else. I looked around the feeding area, wondering if there had been a mistake. But I knew deep down that the zoo was testing me again. My heart pounded in my chest as I recalled the rule. It felt like a trick, like I had to feed the animals or break the rule. There was no winning. Before I could make a decision, the shadows around me shifted, and I heard movement from the nearby enclosures. The eerie sounds of animals, unfamiliar and unsettling, whispered through the trees. For a moment, it felt like they were closing in. I glanced at the empty bin once more and stepped back, my instinct telling me not to do anything that could make things worse. The rule was clear, and breaking it could cause everything to spiral out of control. But the silence was oppressive, and I couldn't help but feel like the animals were staring at me, waiting for a decision I wasn't ready to make. I left the area quickly, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the oppressive quiet. Every time I passed an enclosure, I felt eyes on me, but when I shone the flashlight inside, the creatures were always still. It was unsettling, like they were waiting for something. But what? As I moved toward the exit to finish my shift, the air grew cold. The zoo seemed to have taken on a life of its own, with each step making the atmosphere heavier. The weight of the unspoken rules I didn't fully understand but knew I had to follow, hung over me. I was almost out of the zoo when I heard it. A voice, soft and distorted, came from behind me. I turned, but there was no one there. The darkness seemed to ripple as something invisible brushed past me. It was as if the zoo itself had become more than just a place. It was alive, breathing, and feeding off my fear. By the sixth night, I was starting to feel like I had no choice but to confront whatever was happening here. The zoo had become a place of constant tension. The rules, I knew, were the only thing standing between me and whatever else lurked in the darkness. This time, I felt the weight of the second rule more heavily than ever. You must be out of the zoo by 5 a.m. sharp. If you're still inside after dawn, you'll never leave. I'd heard the whispers about workers who never left, and I was beginning to understand that the zoo was something much worse than I'd imagined. I'd barely started my patrol when I noticed something moving in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe an animal stirring, but then it stopped. And when I looked again, I saw a figure, a person, standing motionless just beyond the light's reach. I wasn't supposed to go near anyone at this hour, especially not someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I approached cautiously, my heart thudding in my chest. As I got closer, I realized this figure wasn't like the others. They were moving, but slowly, like they were dragging their feet. Their eyes were vacant, glazed over, and they didn't seem to notice me at all. I asked them their name, as the rules required. "Who are you?" I repeated louder this time. The figure didn't respond. They just stood there, swaying slightly. It was then I remembered the first rule. If you encounter another employee who appears dazed or unfamiliar, ask them their name. If they hesitate, run. I didn't have to ask again. I knew they wouldn't answer. The hesitation, the blank look, they were part of the zoo's twisted design. My instincts screamed at me to run, to break the rules and save myself. But I stood frozen for a moment, caught in the grip of fear. And in that split second, the figure took a step toward me. I didn't hesitate any longer. I turned and bolted in the opposite direction, not daring to look back. The sound of footsteps echoed in the distance, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing there. I didn't stop running until I was back in the security office. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, my pulse still racing. I glanced at the clock. It was 4:30 a.m. I had half an hour to get out of here. I was trembling as I left the security office. Every shadow in the zoo now felt like it was closing in on me. It was 4:40 a.m., and I had only 20 minutes to make it out of the zoo before the second rule took effect. The air was heavy with a strange, unnatural stillness. I told myself I couldn't keep running. I had to make it to the exit. My mind raced, but I focused on my steps, forcing my feet to move forward. Every sound I heard seemed magnified in the silence. Footsteps, breathing, the soft rustling of leaves. I tried to stick to the main path, but my feet took me in the direction of the exhibits instead. It felt like I was being pulled off course by some invisible force. There was no denying it anymore. Something in this zoo didn't want me to leave. As I passed the reptile exhibit, I noticed something odd. The glass cages were empty, but the creatures inside them, whatever they had been, felt so present. Their absence seemed wrong, like the zoo had somehow absorbed them, or worse, they had been replaced by something else. I stopped for a moment, listening to the eerie quiet. That's when I noticed the breathing. It was faint, almost too soft to hear, but unmistakable. It came from behind me, from somewhere deeper within the zoo. I turned, but there was nothing. The breathing had stopped. I knew then what the third rule was. Do not run if you hear soft breathing behind you. Walk calmly to the nearest light source. I hesitated for a second, my heart pounding. I knew the rule, and I knew I couldn't break it. Not now, not with the things that had been stalking me. I forced myself to walk slowly, to not give in to the panic that was bubbling up inside me. I made my way toward the nearest light, trying not to think about what was out there, just out of sight. As I moved, I could still hear the breathing, but it was getting louder, more urgent, like it was following me. My body screamed to run, but I couldn't. If I did, I knew I'd be breaking the one rule that had kept me safe so far. I reached the light. For a moment, the breathing stopped. The shadows seemed to recede, but the air was thick with tension. Whatever was out there, it hadn't given up. I tried to steady myself. The clock was ticking. I had to get to the exit. The light flickered as I moved forward, casting long, stretching shadows along the path. The zoo felt alive in a way I couldn't explain. The trees swayed gently, but there was no wind. The animals' calls were distant, like they were part of a dream, not reality. I felt like I was walking through a world between worlds, a place where the rules didn't just govern what was visible, but twisted the very fabric of the place itself. I had to keep moving, or I'd be swallowed whole. The clock showed 4:50 a.m. now. My time was running out. I was almost at the exit when I passed by the food storage area again. I didn't want to stop, but something drew me in. The bins, empty once again, were standing there waiting for me. I knew I shouldn't stop. I remembered the fourth rule. Never feed the animals anything except what is provided in the designated bins. But the strange pull to do something, anything to make sense of all this, was too strong. I stepped closer, scanning the area. The last time I'd been here, the bins were completely empty, but now there was something different. A faint smell hung in the air, something rancid and sickening. My stomach churned, but I couldn't turn away. Something about the smell made my skin crawl, and I knew I had to leave fast. But as I turned, I heard the faintest noise, like claws scraping against concrete. My heart stopped. The shadowy shapes in the enclosures were stirring, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. They were awake now. I broke the rule, I knew it, but there was no time to second-guess myself. I ran. The animals' eyes followed me as I dashed past, and I could hear their low growls rising with my every step. The path seemed to stretch longer than it ever had, like the exit was moving farther away. It was as if the zoo didn't want me to leave, not yet. With every turn I made, I could hear the breathing again, now joined by something else, scratching, skittering, as if something unseen was trailing just behind me. I could feel the fear tightening its grip around my chest. The creatures of the zoo, the predators, they were no longer just stories. They were real, and they were hunting me. I had to make it. I couldn't stop now. I didn't know how I was still moving. Every muscle in my body screamed for rest, but I pushed forward, driven by sheer instinct. The clock was ticking. It was 4:55 a.m. now, and I could hear the zoo coming alive behind me, like a monster stirring from a deep, unnatural slumber. I was so close to the exit, but it felt like the path was stretching farther away with each step. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows were closing in faster than I could run. I wasn't alone anymore. The breathing was closer, more intense now. There was something in the air, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I could feel the weight of it, the pressure of it, pressing in from all sides. I turned, desperate to see what was following me. The shadows shifted unnaturally, coiling in on themselves, like they were alive. And then I saw it. A shape in the dark, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was moving toward me, its form shifting in and out of the darkness like it was part of the very shadows themselves. I knew in that instant that this was the predator, the one that had been stalking me since I'd arrived, the one that thrived on fear. But there was one thing I remembered from my time as a photographer. Light. I'd used it to capture the truth of a moment, to reveal what others couldn't see. This was the predator's weakness. I reached into my bag, fumbling with the camera, my hands shaking so badly that I almost dropped it. But I couldn't hesitate. I couldn't. I snapped the flash. The creature recoiled, its form briefly illuminated in the harsh light. It was translucent, its body barely holding any form at all, like it was made of smoke and shadow. But when the light hit it, it became real, solid, even if only for a moment. I clicked the camera again, and again, the flashes blinding in the dim light of the zoo. With each burst, the creature seemed to weaken, its form flickering and disappearing, only to return stronger than before. But I kept snapping, kept exposing it for what it was, until it was no longer just a shadow. And that's when I saw it. The containment cell, a small, barely noticeable room tucked behind one of the enclosures. I had seen it earlier in my patrols, but I hadn't thought it was important. Now it was my only hope. I backed toward the cell, the creature following me, its eyes burning with an unnatural hunger. It lunged at me, but I was faster. I turned the camera toward the reflection of the creature in the glass, the lens flashing again and again. The creature faltered, confused, its own reflection trapping it. I didn't stop. I kept snapping until it backed into the cell, the door slamming shut with a deafening bang. It was trapped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and my body was trembling with the adrenaline of what I'd just done. I had survived, but barely. I didn't know what to feel at first, relief or dread. The zoo was still, the unnatural creatures hidden once again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only contained the threat, not destroyed it. I slowly walked toward the exit, each step feeling heavier than the last. I had broken the rules. I had paid the price, and I'd managed to survive. But I knew the truth now. The zoo wasn't just a place, it was a prison. A prison for things that shouldn't exist. I made it to the gate, just as the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. It was 5 a.m. sharp. I stepped outside, my heart still racing, my mind reeling. I couldn't believe what had just happened. But I couldn't forget it either. The creatures were still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for someone to make the mistake of stepping too far from the path. I knew they couldn't be destroyed. They were part of this place, bound to it, just like I was. But I had learned something. The zoo's rules weren't just a way to keep people safe. They were a way to keep the creatures dormant, to keep them contained. And now the world would know. I couldn't let this place keep its secrets anymore. The rules had to be known, had to be enforced. No one should ever step into this zoo without understanding what they were up against. I was done with this place, but the zoo would never be done with me. I walked away, knowing that the creatures I'd trapped were only the beginning. The world would soon learn what lurked in the shadows of the zoo, and I would make sure it stayed that way, locked away behind the walls where it belonged. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe for daily horror stories that get creepier every night.